Well, hi there, I'm Noah Bradley, and this is Handmade House TV. On this week's episode, I'm going to answer more viewer questions, 4 of them in fact, all of them with regard to log cabins. So stay tuned. Well, all right, once again, thank you for tuning in here to Handmade House TV. I've got 4 questions that I'd like to cover, and hopefully I can come up with some good answers to them as well. So let's get started on this. The first one is, Noah, thank you for everything. I found an easy way to get through the permitting process. The Department of Energy. This question is from a great guy who's been in touch with me on many times. He's a member of the guild, and thank you for signing up. And he's asked me questions in the past. He's been dealing with issues with regard to getting a permit, which is something we cover in the Log Cabin Academy. How when you're building a handcrafted home, how do you get through the hoops in a government system that likes to make everybody live in vinyl-covered boxes? And he's got particular challenges, at least he had particular challenges, with regard to the insulation demands that the Building Inspection Department wanted to see that his handcrafted, unique, traditionally built log cabin met modern code expectations with regard to insulation. And I gave him some tips, and he has come back with the fact that he found a website where you input all of the conditions with regard to your home, and basically what it does is that it will, when you get done, it will issue a certificate of compliance from the Department of Energy. And it says the plans inspector said that's exactly what he was looking for, and voila, he passed through the hurdle of trying to get approval for the insulation value of a unique handcrafted structure. And so the website that he went to, I will put this up in a little box on one side of me here or another, and it's basically www.energycodes.gov/rescheck. Anyway, I think that's a great resource to use. I wish I had known of it in the past, but I think it could help you. To be honest with you, I don't think I had one inspector give me issues with regard to that, and I handled it all through other techniques that I shared within the Log Cabin Academy. So anyway, there's question number 1. Great tip for you there. Question number 2. Isn't there a huge difference in air-dried logs versus kiln-dried logs? I have, as a carpenter, as a home builder, I've used a tremendous amount of kiln-dried lumber in my past. I think it's almost difficult to buy lumber at any kind of place and not get it kiln-dried nowadays. Everything I've understood with regard to lumber is that there is a detrimental effect to the overall quality of wood if it is kiln dried. If you're a fine furniture builder and you're after the ultimate detail and the quality of the wood, that natural air dried wood is superior to kiln dried. There's something harmful or harsh to wood to some degree when it is speedily, the moisture is sucked out of it, and it does in a regular drying cycle rather than what happens in nature, and that makes sense. It's been a while since I've read that. Typically when I'm building some kind of furniture, I prefer to use air-dried wood myself, and perhaps we'll have it topped off with a little bit of kiln drying at the very end of it in order to bring it down to the proper moisture level. With regard to logs being kiln dried, my understanding is that in the log cabin kit industry, that basically any logs that you purchase would be kiln dried. And kiln drying logs is a whole lot different than kiln drying lumber, and that is that it's a much more radical procedure. When you're kiln drying only an inch thick wood, it doesn't take a whole lot of time nor stress on the wood in order to go penetrate 1 inch of the wood. When you're talking about a log that's 6 to 8 inches thick, From what I understand, I had a long discussion years ago with a local company that makes pressure treated post, and basically they have to kiln dry things in order to treat them. They have to dry the wood out in order that the wood will be able to absorb the toxins in order to keep them from being rot resistant. And from what this individual shared with me is that the interior of the wood never gets to the point of really being super dry, and the outside of the wood does get checked and cracked more often than the interior of the wood. So I never work with kiln dried. I wouldn't pay the expense of that. I think that a lot of people worry far too much about logs being dry or seasoned enough. I haven't ever had any detrimental effects to working with green wood. I can understand how that potential is there. I can understand why people are concerned about it. But I personally wouldn't pay for that. I would much rather my log cabin dry and seasoned naturally. Anyway, I hope that answered your question. Anyway, the next question would be, which corner notch is the most secure notch? Full dovetail, half dovetail, V notch, etc., etc. Which is the easiest to work with? Which is used the most? I'm thinking about using a full dovetail with no gap in between the logs to allow for an overall settlement of the logs to dry out at some reasonable time. The log will be 4 inches wide and 8 inches tall. I own a sawmill, so my logs will be cut rectangular. Your recommendation and advice is greatly appreciated. Plus, I guess that's the end of it. Traditionally there are four different kinds of notches that I commonly see in vintage historic log cabins. I would think that 45% of them are half dovetail, 45% of them are V-notch, and then that leaves a little 10% gap in the end, and almost every one of those would be a square notch. And then the other bit may be made up of unique, unusual ones. It is extremely rare for me to encounter a full dovetail on a log cabin. The full dovetails are a whole new level of complexity to do. I appreciate full dovetails in furniture. I do not appreciate them in log cabins, and that is because part of the inclination of the cut is tapered to the inside of the log, whereas if you're building a log cabin and you use full dovetail, if water gets in between your notches of a full dovetail, water will penetrate the notch and it won't find a way out. And in my opinion, it'll lead to rot, and that's something that you do not want in a log cabin. So I think you're going to a whole lot of extra effort in order to create a full dovetail. I don't think it's that much more attractive. I don't think it's that much stronger. Any extra strength would not be needed. But what you're doing is you're going to end up risking the loss of the corners of your log home. And that would be true as well of the square notch, which is, some people would think of it, looking at it, as the easiest notch to create. A square notch or a flat notch is one that is always used on houses or outbuildings that are sided over. A square notch will not hold up to exposure to weather. Water will find its way in, it won't find its way out, and it will rot. And a square notch, a flat notch, is also the weakest notch there is. The only way that you can keep your home held together is by drilling holes down through the notches as you're putting the cabin together and pegging those corners. So that brings us to the V notch, which is extremely common type of notch in a log cabin. It is one that I've used many times, but it's not one that I prefer. In my opinion, it's harder to build, harder to create than a half dovetail. It is plenty strong enough, it's plenty attractive enough, and it's plenty historical enough. It's just a little bit more complicated to put it looks simpler, and I think that's the reason why many of the early individuals used the V-notch as much as they did, but in reality the half dovetail is easier, and I think it looks more impressive. So the star of the entire the talk here is by far the half dovetail. It is incredibly strong, it is incredibly attractive, it is easy to do, and it also will carry the water away from the notch, regardless. That no water will if any water finds its way into the notch, it will immediately be pulled out through the force of gravity. I should make a couple other comments with regard to your question, and you're probably already aware of that, but you made a comment with no gap in between the logs. I don't advise that at all. I'm a big fan of allowing a gap between the logs. Wherever two pieces of wood come together, you're going to have rot, and I don't do that. So I'm a big fan of having a gap between the logs as traditionally done, with a chink joint in between. I think I can go into details on that. With time, you'll find that it'll hold up a whole lot longer, and actually I think that with developed time, it actually becomes more attractive to most people. And then it says here that you're going to cut your logs square or rectangular in shape, and again, I don't advise that. I much prefer the irregular contours, the natural contours, curves, and everything else associated with the logs. I only cut the inside and outside faces of my logs, so I don't recommend you doing that if at all possible. Anyway, I think that covers your question. Thank you very much for asking. And then our final question, number 4. And this was an individual who I responded to before. And I think I answered his question on a previous email, and he's following up with more content here. And he's got a really great attitude, and I really appreciate that. He realizes that I'm not trying to ding-dong anyone, tell them that they're doing wrong or tell them what to do right. I'm just giving you my honest opinion from what I've observed through 30 years of working with log cabins, going on 40 years. Yeah, I'm getting old. It says here that our land is extremely steep. The majority of our trees are not very straight, and they have a high degree of taper in them, meaning that they're one width at one end of the log and narrow at the other. So I won't be getting very long or consistent width logs. So that's the reason why he's considered sawing all 4 sides of the logs and not doing the contour. Have you ever had to deal with this issue? Are there other solutions other than sawing all 4 sides of your logs? I know you're in the South and you have a much more wide variety of wood species and larger trees. Following up on that thought of getting longer logs, is there a joint that you would recommend that sheds water in the middle of a wall? Okay, so there's 2 questions here, and that is how to deal with logs that have an extreme taper to them. And let me share with you an image out of Charles McCraven's book on building the hewn log cabin. It's one of the books that I highly recommend with regard to building a log cabin. If you don't have a copy on your shelf, you really ought to get one. This particular image shows you a great way of dealing with tapered logs from one end to the other, and basically you just rotate this going back and forth as you go up your cabin. I would still advise you, if there's any way possible, to not square your logs. You'll end up with a much more attractive log cabin if you choose not to do that. And then with regard to your question concerning what kind of joint could be used in order to shed water when you're doing a joint in the middle of your wall, in the middle of a log. First thing that I can comment is avoid doing this if at all possible. The vast majority of log cabins that I do, I would not do that. There have been instances where I have done that, You wouldn't want to do it in order to make your log cabin longer. The only time you'd really want to incorporate some kind of joint is basically if you're running short on logs, and this is what you need to do in order to finish your log cabin. You want to make sure and have at least one or two logs in your log cabin that span from one end to the other in order to obtain the greatest security and structural strength of your home. But basically, it's basically just a half lap. If I were to do this particular log here, it would be a cut down to the middle point and then over a foot, or ideally 2 or 3 feet, and then another lap where a half lap comes in, and then I would peg or screw through the logs in order to get a nice fit. And what I would do is I would probably caulk or glue as much as possible the joint to forbid water from coming into the particular joint as much as possible, and I would keep a very close eye on it as time went by. Well, okay, that about wraps it up for today. That was 4 questions with regard to log cabins. Thank you very much for joining me. Before we go, I would like to thank 5 new members of the Handmade House Guild. They are Matthew Waters, Mark Silverman, Randall Steverson, John Scheiffelben. Got it, sorry, John. And Zach Hunsicker. Thank you, each one of you, for joining the Handmade House Guild. And if you're not already a member, consider coming over to Handmade House and signing up soon. We look forward to seeing you here next week on Handmade House TV. And until then, you guys take care. We'll see you then. Bye now.